It's been a few weeks since the release of patch 10.1.5, and since then we've had a fair few rounds of class tuning. Have Shadow Priests finally been dethroned as the best caster? Will augmentation of Ochres remain mandatory after their hotfixes? And with the extensive tank balancing, are Guardian Druids still on top? We've got all this and much more to cover as we break down all of the winners and losers from the patch, thanks to the help of our esteemed Echo and Method consultants and analyzing the most recent data. Starting off, we've got our tank winners of the patch. The first, of course, being Guardian Druid, who after their slight talent rework are set to dominate the tank meta. The major highlight of this was this line here, Raze no longer replacing Maul, giving Guardian Druids access to both a single target and AoE spender. Overall though, the talent tree adjustment has opened up a multitude of diversity between builds, especially with talents like Dream of Cenarius and Thorn of Iron now being easily accessible. And as a result, every aspect of Guardian Druid has greatly improved. They deal more AoE damage, more single target damage, have more off-healing and self-healing, as well as even more survivability. This was slightly toned down on July 26th with the minor nerf to Ursark's Fury, but Guardian Druid was already inside of our S tier prior to 10.1.5, and they've only gotten stronger since, now being considered the undisputed meta tank. Also coming out on the winning end of the patch as a whole were Brewmaster Monks, receiving a multitude of very impactful changes, increasing their damage and helping to combat some of their inherent button bloat issues. Dance of the Wind being one of the highlights, which when paired up with their tier set, not only results in a bunch of additional survivability, but also damage output. This is then paired up alongside a slew of damage increases, which more than offset the nerf to Amulet, including a 7% damage increase across the board, as well as further increases to Rising Sun Kick, Blackout Kick, Tiger Palm, and Invoke New Zao, which at the start of the patch left them with the potential of even competing with certain DPS specs on overall damage. This was, however, on July 26th, offset with some pretty hefty nerfs to their AoE damage with tuning to both Keg Smash and Spinning Crane Kick. As a whole, they are still looking considerably stronger than prior to 10.1.5, with their only real weakness right now being their slightly pale survivability and utility kit compared to the more meta tanks. But the addition of augmentation of Ochre does definitely help with the former. Brewmaster has the potential for big things this season if we do ever end up seeing a shift in the meta, but for now, mainly due to how dominant Guardian is. We'll be keeping them inside of our B tier. As for the tank losers, the only real downside of the patch comes thanks to a shift in the meta. Protection Paladins came out on the winning end of the patch in terms of tuning, receiving multiple increases to their rather lackluster damage, both on July 26th and with the release of 10.1.5 itself, which also included a slight nerf change to Word of Glory that really only impacts 4 DPS dungeons. As we know though, group setup is obviously a huge point of contention in Mythic Plus, and for Protection Paladin, a lot of their value comes from all that additional party utility that they provide, meaning naturally with Holy Paladins rising to the forefront of the meta, the value of Protection Paladin dwindles. So for now, we'll be moving them down half a tier to our A tier. Also coming out on the losing end of the last few weeks are Vengeance Demon Hunters, who have received the least amount of changes compared to the rest of the tanks. Prior to patch, Vengeance Demon Hunter was considered by top players the strongest overall tank, contributed in large to their outstanding damage output, great survivability, and the abundance of mob control that they provide. Coupled, of course, with the previously must-have buff from Chaos Brand, which has now become a lot less mandatory due to the introduction of augmentation of Ochre. However, much like with Protection Paladins, the rise of Guardian Druid has pushed Vengeance Demon Hunter slightly down the food chain. As a result, we'll be moving them down from S tier to A+. Taking a look at our consolidated tank tier list, we've got Guardian Druid at the top, taking our coveted S tier. Since the patch, Guardian has been centric to essentially all of the highest completed keys right now. Vengeance Demon Hunter remains to be in a very solid spot, but will be dropping down half a tier due to the rise of Guardian Druid. Overall though, they're still performing slightly ahead of the rest of the tanks, offering a great mixture of a damage and survivability, as well as, of course, providing Chaos Brand. In our lowest tier of B, we find Brewmaster Monks, Blood Death Knights, and Protection Warriors. These three tanks have all made considerable strides toward catching up with the rest of the pack thanks to several damage increases since 10.1.5. Among them, Blood Death Knights have experienced the most significant improvement. Despite their lack of team utility and certain survivability concerns, they may not be all that highly represented in the absolute peak of key levels. But if you can manage the incoming damage and avoid getting one shot, they can be a formidable and self-sufficient choice to consider. Next up, we're moving to our melee winners. It has to be said that in this meta, we're using the term winner rather lightly here. Going into the patch, Sub was already one of the standout melee, not only for their damage, but also thanks to all their additional tools. 10.1.5 blessed Subtlety with a 4% increase across the board to all damage. Although this is to offset the nerfs to Onyx Amulet and the Aranog Ring, it still works out to be an overall increase. Previously, in our tier list, we had them placed in the S tier, and their performance has only improved since the patch, firmly establishing themselves as the only true, viable melee spec at the peak of key levels in the current meta. Also winning this patch was Outlaw Rogue, receiving a 9% blanket buff to all damage, as well as a redesign to the Grand Melee buff granted from Roll the Bones, which is vastly superior in a Mythic Plus setting. Together, these have definitely helped to make Outlaw slightly more competitive, but with the dominance of Subtlety Rogue right now, Outlaw would need far more than this to be able to compete. So for this reason, we'll still be keeping them inside of our A tier for now. Lastly, the final melee coming out ahead this patch is Havoc Demon Hunter, who after getting 0 changes in 10.1.5 are actually going to be climbing up one tier. This comes primarily as a result of Guardian Druid's rise in popularity, opening up room for Havoc as a far more appealing option for players wanting the damage increase from Chaos Brand. We'll be moving Havoc up from B tier to A tier. Moving over to the melee losers, it's fair to say it's been a rough couple of weeks for pretty much every melee that isn't Subtlety right now. The first mention, surprisingly, is Feral Druid, who as a spec actually got some pretty impactful buffs, with the highlight being the brand new talent Dire Fixation, which has helped to improve their previously rather dire single target damage output. Although this has definitely improved their standing in Mythic Plus, it's nowhere near enough to make them the preferred choice over Balanced Druid. Not to mention, the rise of Guardian has also diminished a lot of the overall utility that Feral provides. As a result, despite overall looking slightly stronger this patch, we'll still be moving Feral down to our B tier to better reflect the meta. Enhancement Shaman saw a bunch of tuning changes, with the most notable being the nerf to Ancestral Guidance, making the ability a lot weaker. However, thanks to the addition of Augmentation Evokers and the rework to Holy Paladins, healing checks have got considerably easier, making the nerf a lot less impactful than it otherwise would have been. Aside from the AG nerf, Enhance also received a ton of additional changes, mostly with the goal of increasing their rather lackluster single target damage, which was their only real weak point in M+ this season. The net result being that their overall AoE damage remains relatively the same, but single target has gained around a 6% increase, even more so in situations where they can funnel damage to take advantage of the Lava Lash buff. That being said, in the higher key levels, enhancement just isn't as standout as it once was, and with specs like Augmentation, Shadow, and Fire Mage all being near mandatory, it's hard to justify bringing an enhancement. As a result, we'll be dropping them down to A+ tier. Another melee spec falling victim to the meta this patch is Retribution Paladin. Retribution has been middle of the pack damage-wise for the majority of the season, and 10.1.5, although bringing a slight 2% damage increase, has negatively affected their representation. This comes in large part thanks to the rise of Holy Paladins, who after their mini rework have cemented themselves as the go-to healer, which for a spec like Retribution, whose strength is primarily attributed to the utility tools they bring to Mythic Plus, only means one thing: we'll be dropping them down one rank to our A+ tier. And with that, we have our 10.1.5 melee tier list accounted for. Overall, the patch hasn't been favorable for the majority of melee specs in Mythic Plus, and this season is shaping up to now be even more dominated by casters than it was previously, with Subtlety Rogue being the only melee DPS left standing in our S tier. Prior to 10.1.5, Enhancement, Fury, and Retribution were all viable options for pushing keys and all widely represented. However, with the introduction of Augmentation and buffs to Fire Mage, it becomes difficult to justify any of these three specs taking up a spot in the top tier anymore. Windwalkers, despite also suffering from the rise of casters, come out of the last few weeks considerably stronger, receiving some new talent additions as well as a big increase to their overall damage output on July 26th. Yet even with these improvements, they still fall short of being a more desirable choice at the highest levels of Mythic Plus play. Survival Hunters, although finding themselves in our lowest tier, did also very recently receive some minor damage increases with buffs to Mongoose Bite, Raptor, and Flanking Strike, as well as Kill Command, resulting in around a 2% increase on single target and a 0.6% increase on AoE. While a slight improvement, it's not exactly the changes Survival needed to make an impression on the meta. Next up, let's cover the ranged winners of the patch and assign WoW's very first support spec, Augmentation Evoker, its inaugural tier list placement. I wonder where it will place. The undisputed winner of the patch is none other than the brand new spec, Augmentation Evoker. Augmentation has quickly become a staple in Mythic Plus keys, playing a role as essential as healers and tanks. Its introduction has revolutionized dungeon runs, enabling players to push key levels previously unimaginable. What sets Augmentation apart is its incredible utility, including the standard Evoker class abilities such as Fury of the Aspects, Zephyr, Cauterizing Flame, and many more. Augmentation significantly enhances the damage output of the entire group through various stat increases like Ebon Might, Shifting Sands, Prescience, and the combined effects of Fate Mirror. During larger pulls, the Augmentation Evoker can unleash devastating damage with Breath of Eons, alongside the coordinated cooldowns of DPS partners, trivializing any pull. Alone, this would honestly be enough for Augmentation to earn its spot in any group, but on top of that, it also boosts the group's survivability. For example, Blistering Scales can be given to tanks, greatly increasing their survivability, threat generation, and damage output. However, the standout ability is Chrono Ward, which provides allies affected by Ebb and Might with a shield of up to 30% of their maximum HP based on the damage they deal during the Breath of Eons window. The July 26th hotfixes did see an attempt at some tuning, toning down some of the support aspects of Augmentation while buffing its personal damage output. For dungeons, this translated very loosely to around a 3% damage nerf. In addition, we also saw changes to the combat log, so we can now more easily identify just how beneficial Augmentation truly is. Prior to this, we all knew Augmentation was clearly very broken, but nobody really completely understood the full extent of just how overpowered and overtuned Augmentation truly was. In summary, unless we see far more significant nerfs over the next few weeks, now that we have a working API, Augmentation Evoker continues to be not just strong, but essential, and rightfully claims its place in our highest tier of S. Also getting some W's this patch are mages, with all 3 specs gaining some huge damage and utility buffs, most notably being the addition of both Mass Barrier and Mass Invisibility, which allows you to grant either your barrier or invisibility to your entire group. So depending on the scenario, mages can either provide an effect akin to Shroud of Concealment, or otherwise offer another party-wide defensive to help cover certain boss mechanics or pulls. For all 3 specs, another great change is the removal of Rune of Power, which was heavily compensated for with a damage increase across the board. This was huge as it was incredibly cumbersome to play with, punishing mages for any amount of movement. The standout winner among the 3 specs is undoubtedly the Fire Mage. With a wide array of new and revamped talents, along with substantial damage increases, their overall damage output and keys has skyrocketed. One significant improvement was the integration of Flame Strike into Hot Streak, making their AoE damage much more potent and consistent rather than relying solely on Ignite. Furthermore, the buff to Sun King's Blessing, extending its duration to 30 seconds from 15, greatly enhances their sustained pressure and limits downtime. On July 18th, we did see hotfixes implemented to address the overwhelming strength of Fire Mage. These adjustments resulted in approximately a 5.5% nerf to single target damage and an 8% nerf to AoE damage, with the magnitude increasing with the number of targets. This, while it may sound drastic, still leaves Fire at the top of the damage meters. Yes, they were that overtuned. Even after the hotfixes, we firmly place Fire Mage in our highest tier, S tier. Slightly behind, but still incredibly strong, are Frost Mages, where in addition to across-the-board damage increases, Icy Veins saw a nice buff, reducing its cooldown and now causing it to provide you with both Frigid Empowerment and a Water Elemental pet, with impactful pet abilities like Water Jet granting you additional ways to shatter your damage. The other highlight is Coldest Snap, which turns Cold of Cold into an offensive cooldown on AoE, resetting the cooldown of both Orb and Comet Storm, providing Frost with some much-needed burst AoE damage. Lastly, we couldn't highlight Frost without mentioning the huge buffs to Glacial Spike, where now, thanks to also interacting with Splitting Ice, can now quite often be top damage in keys. Post-hotfixes, Frost suffered a slight nerf to primarily their AoE damage output, which will make the Sub-Zero build less prominent. However, similarly to Fire, they will continue to be near the top of the ranged food chain. And for now, we'll be placing them inside of our A+ tier. Arcane has also improved drastically, sporting a brand new AoE rotation, thanks to the newly designed Orb Barrage, causing Arcane Barrage to have a chance to shoot Arcane Orbs, which together with Surge and Radiant Spark can make Arcane great at burning down packs, with a rotation of just spamming Arcane Barrage and Arcane Explosion. Overall though, they keep their niche of incredibly strong burst damage during cooldowns, but just now have slightly better AoE damage to go alongside. That being said, they're still lacking when compared to both Frost and Fire, so for now, we'll be moving them up just one tier from C to B. Moving over to the ranged losers now, our first spec after a rather dominant start of the season is set to fall slightly out of the meta, that being Balanced Druid. This comes as a result of a few factors. First are the patch changes. Fury of Elune has had its damage decreased as well as its cooldown increased by 5 seconds. While this may not seem like a big deal, 45 seconds is a common timer for a lot of important boss mechanics. For example, Bromok's Quaking Totem, making it a lot harder to coordinate your damage. Also, another key change was the nerf to Nature's Grace, which now only triggers after an eclipse ends, resulting in considerably lower uptime on the haste increase. Then we've got a nerf to Vigil. While this is admittedly not as much of an issue thanks to Augmentation Evokers, it's still something to consider. The biggest factor though has to be the shift in the meta. We've mentioned it a few times now, but when a new tank or healer becomes the go-to, it can often cause the same class DPS specs to fall out of priority. So with Guardian Druid now being the meta tank and the addition of Augmentation Evokers taking up another caster slot, Balanced Druids end up just being left out. Looking at the consolidated range tier list. Remaining at the top, Shadow Priest received the smallest of the across-the-board group healing nerfs in 10.1.5, with Vampiric Embrace only getting a 3-second duration nerf. But more recently, they received what at first glance may seem like very detrimental AoE nerfs for Mythic Plus, toning down the effectiveness of Psychic Link while compensating by buffing their single target damage. The results of these changes equated to approximately a 3% nerf across the overall dungeon, but a single target damage increase of around 8%, meaning as a whole, Shadow Priest will still be just as mandatory as before, but now have slightly more boss and priority damage. And together with both Fire and Augmentation Evoker, they make up our S tier and staple 3 DPS you'll see across almost all high-level keys currently. Devastation Evokers in our A tier received some slight changes, reducing the effectiveness of their mastery while compensating with a static damage increase. This should be a relatively neutral change, making damage considerably less front-loaded, which will hopefully solve threat issues. Looking at the lower end of the tier list, Affliction received some rather stellar changes and will be climbing up one rank. While they're unlikely to break into the pushing meta over some of the more dominant casters, it has gained significant ground through the changes to Doom Blossom, the new talent Xavius Gambit, as well as a reduction in Seed of Corruption cast time reduction. Both specs of Hunter are still left to rot in our lowest tier, although they can both dish out considerable levels of damage and have got a lot stronger this patch thanks to the recent tuning. The point still remains that the only real benefit Hunters bring to a group right now comes solely from their damage output, meaning unless we see something ridiculous like a 50% damage increase, putting them by far at the top of the meters, or a rework to some of their missing utility and survivability, Hunter in its current form just sadly isn't a contender for the top spot. However, it is essential to note that they are more than viable for any key difficulty below the absolute peak. With mages getting a new talent tree to include additional party utility, are hunters maybe going to be the next in line? Echo's Roger Brown has already been on the case, suggesting some great ideas to help make hunters more valuable. Finally, let's wrap things up with some changes to the healer meta by first discussing the winners of the patch. Of course, the standout winner is Holy Paladin, who already prior to the patch was one of the most dominant healers. 10.1.5 solidified their position further, putting them far above the competition, granting huge increases to overall casted healing and a ton of new and reworked talents. With the whole talent tree now feeling much more interconnected, it's created room for much more interesting and varied talent builds for accentuating either damage or healing. Breaking down some of the highlights, Glimmer was greatly enhanced to now not only convert all overhealing to an absorb shield on the target, but now also even provides an additional damage reduction. Tyr's Deliverance also saw huge improvements, having its healing improved while also now benefiting from Holy Shock, as well as interacting with the talent Boundless Salvation, giving Paladins an additional throughput cooldown. Holy Paladin right now is the complete package, providing high damage output, strong healing, powerful cooldowns, and everything else you would want from a healer. We did, however, see some balance hotfixes coming in, but honestly, all this does is bring them slightly more in line and less like they're playing an entirely different game to the rest of the healers. So, despite the nerfs, we'll be placing them firmly inside of our S tier. As for losers, there were two significant nerfs. The first to Resto Shaman's Ancestral Guidance, where the potential healing per tick will now be capped at 20% of your maximum health. Essentially, this change means you will no longer want to pair Ancestral Guidance with any other cooldowns, and will lose quite a bit of added healing to Cloudburst Totem during your cooldowns. Although this was offset by a few buffs to overall healing output, they're still left a shadow of their former self, especially when compared to the likes of both Holy Paladin and Preservation Evoker. And the same goes for Restoration Druids and their Nature's Vigil. Nature's Vigil now lasts 15 seconds down from 30, and all Resto Druid damage was buffed 25% to compensate. The impact this has will depend on how much of your damage was in those Nature's Vigil windows versus your time actively spent dealing damage, meaning especially on higher keys, it will more than likely end up being an overall reduction. But in summary, neither of these changes should warrant either healer experiencing any movement on our tier list, leaving our compiled 10.1.5 healer tier list looking like what you see on screen now. Preservation Evokers are left feeling marginally stronger after the patch, with some positive changes to both Lifegiver's Flame and Emerald Blossom, as well as also receiving further beneficial passive talents in the Evoker tree from Regenerative Magic and Potent Mana. In addition, their healing abilities will be increased by 2%, followed by a 10% buff to all of their damaging abilities. Keep in mind that to compensate for those changes, Rewind has received a noticeable nerf. All in all, leaving them slightly ahead of the rest of the pack, but still considerably behind Holy Paladin. The rest of the healer tier remains fairly balanced, with the majority of the specs receiving minor damage increases to compensate for the Onyx Amulet nerf. Both priest specs did get some new talents, but for the most part, these are set to either be undertuned in the case of Essence Devourer, or just not really designed for Mythic Plus like Luminous Barrier for Discipline. Holy Priest, despite being in our lowest tier, did end up seeing a positive change with the new talent Epiphany, in addition to Burning Vehemence now being far more accessible. This will, however, not be enough to warrant moving them up a tier. Before we wrap things up, we want to hear from you. We're currently working alongside some of the best players in the world to develop high-quality guides for Mythic Plus. With that in mind, what topics would you like us to cover next? Do you have any specific pain points you'd like help with? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video and want to see more, be sure to subscribe. As always, though, we want to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you soon.